What's up guys? Welcome back to the channel Hand Waving. Your friend Naruto Addict 2.0 is here again with a brand new Naruto fanfic that's going to change everything. A story where Naruto is betrayed and banished. But destiny has bigger plans for him. From exile to emperor, this is the journey of power, strategy, and love. Today's fanfic is titled, What if Naruto rewound the Chunin exams until he became Konoha's savior and won Hinata's love? Part 2. For example, there were ninja medics, ninja who focused on special moves or secret powers, elemental wielders and even illusion specialists. Getting people to teach him cool special moves had been a goal all along, and it hadn't been turning up much. So it seemed best to look to other areas, at least until something opened up. Other than the basic clone technique, Naruto knew next to nothing about illusions, except what Ebisu had said about his transformation not having those same vulnerabilities. He knew that they required power, something he had a lot of, imagination, another area in which he was gifted, and skill. Well, of the lot, the only area he wasn't already well supplied in was skill, and that could be remedied. The only thing now was some instructions to follow, and he could get started. And, it just so happened that one of those people the Hokage was regularly sending him off to learn under was Kurenai, who was an illusion specialist. Feeling buoyed up by this new hope, Naruto bounced up out of bed and set off to go see Kurenai. Holding a letter from the Hokage in her hands, the illusion mistress was speaking in a somewhat resigned tone of voice. The problem, Uzumaki, is that not everyone can learn to use illusions, certainly not the higher-ranking ones. You need a good imagination, which I'm sure you have, but also good chakra control, which I'm just as sure you don't. The boy took a deep breath and responded reasonably, Are you sure you can't give me some test? I've got the basic clone fully mastered, and without the use of seals. I'm willing to work hard, he pled. The Jonin sighed. She hated giving kids bad news, but this one practically pled for it. Okay, show me your clone. He did, and she was impressed. It appeared before she'd even finished asking and the kid hadn't used any hand seals to do it. The tiniest wisp of smoke was the only sign of its appearance, and without that she would have suspected the kid of having already hid a clone around a corner just waiting for her to ask before bringing it out. I'm impressed. She nodded her head. That's as good a clone as I've ever found. The problem is all of the other illusions are at least a full rank higher. How good is your chakra control, really? Above average, he told her earnestly, leaving out the barely part of that Ebisu had tacked on when he'd told him his grade, because when he did tack it on she'd turn him down based on that. Of course, he'd been about as low on control as you could get before the whole time loop thing, and since she didn't know about the loops, but had heard about his abysmal control through the Jonin grapevine, she didn't believe what he'd said, thinking he was just trying to butter her up. Show me, she told him straight out. How? He pled, and when she began to look at him askance he blurted, the leaf floating exercise. Sure, no problem. I can do wall and water walking too, if you want me to. Plainly doubtful, she motioned for him to continue, and so he took a fresh leaf out of his pouch before causing it to hover above his forehead, where he held it with only minor spins or wobbles. It was good, but not good enough. Kurenai was a little surprised. You were right. You do have above average chakra control, if only barely. She didn't see him hide his wince as she stood up. But when I said good control I meant it. Sorry, Uzumaki, but I really do need a student to have good control, or I'd just be wasting my time. Waste 1 hour. Just 1 hour. He pled with her again, this time clasping his hands together and dropping to his knees, making the Jonin feel terrible about it as she shook her head and departed, leaving Naruto alone. The boy sighed, dropping his pose and feeling depressed. This conversation had been the product of numerous repeats where he'd been trying to convince her and learning how to play her reactions to gain the best of all possible chances. Not even showing her his unique transformation helped, as she was able to pick it out as, not an illusion, right off the bat, and she was only going to qualify him based on illusions, or better chakra control than he had. He'd asked for less time before, but the illusion mistress had said she couldn't give a complete lesson in less than an hour. So, maybe illusions would have to wait a while. There were also, he reflected, seals. And one of the greatest known masters of that specialty was in Konoha right now, peeping on bathhouses. But since Jiraiya would not teach him anything else, he doubted he'd teach him that. Sigh. Back to Ebisu for more chakra control, he figured. Since it was still early in the day, and he'd passed the written test, the only times he got a note to see Hinata's teacher from the Hokage were when he'd passed the written test. It would be another 2-day wait before he could see the special Jonin again if he went by the ordinary schedule. Not wanting to delay that long, Naruto forged a note to Ebisu from the Hokage. He'd seen it often enough to be able to copy it with his eyes closed. It would get caught later, not having any of the proper security seals, but it could have non-functional copies written on, and by the time they caught it he'd have already reset anyway. Naruto had been meeting with Ebisu far less often of late. It wasn't that he didn't want to know what the special Jonin had to teach him, but that most of the things he taught were ones he'd learned already. The same pointers and exercises to perfect one technique were often the same ones he'd taught him to perfect another. So, really, he didn't have to visit him as often to get the same value. What Naruto would do was practice on his own during normal hours of his daily schedule while busy doing other things, checking in periodically with the teaching specialist to make sure he was on the right path. But really, he'd gotten good enough at teaching himself that only rarely did the special Jonin have something to say that contradicted what he'd already been doing. So, it saved time and was less frustrating to go through the exercises and drills and stuff for perfecting his techniques on his own. Still, it was an old and tired routine even so, showing up and going through the motions of the tests Ebisu gave him, turning this way, then that, lifting one leg, and assuming martial arts stances which were now substantially improved over what he'd originally done, but that only served to remind him of that barrier he couldn't cross, and irritate him further. Very well, tell me what techniques you already know. Naruto sighed, beginning again the litany. My basic 3 are fully mastered, seal-less and almost traceless. Body flicker likewise. I also know the shadow clone, and 2 unique distraction techniques of my own devising, but you already know about those, the boy finished with a knowing grin. Ebisu coughed and adjusted his glasses, attempting to master a slight blush. Yes, well. Naruto smiled. That jibe was intentional, and had often saved him from an hour of tests as his teacher made him prove those claims. It also saved him from having to reveal his transformation was an S-rank solid variant rather than the usual illusionary one. Apparently deciding something, the teacher casually pulled a scroll out of his pouch and tossed it to him. Here, that is a treatise on basic elemental tips and chakra control exercises. Why don't you practice that for a while? As the special Jonin walked off, leaving him, Naruto's face was screwed up in agony and his fists were clenched tightly over the scroll. You mean this guy had that with him the entire time? It was all he could do not to follow after Ebisu and hit the guy. Mastering his ire, the boy sat down to memorize that scroll, not just read it, but completely commit the contents to memory so he didn't have to do the whole routine with Ebisu to see it again. His memory had been substantially improved by his time stuck in all of these repeating days, and it had gotten better faster once he'd unlocked some of his mental power after he'd begun to really read. But, bless the library, there had been a few books in there on enhancing memory. It was a shinobi village, after all, and they often had need to remember things without writing them down. So he put himself to work memorizing that scroll, and would call himself done only once he could copy it out by hand from memory. After that, he'd start to work on those things it described. He fell asleep in the forest while still studying that scroll. For the second time in his life, Naruto opened his eyes to a person bending over him, after having slept all night in a forest, exhausted from too much training. Hi. You know it isn't safe to be out here all night. There are bears and things in these forests. Groaning, Naruto sat up, looking at who'd addressed him. Tenten, right, on the same team as Neji and Rock Lee. The girl was surprised. Yeah, how do you know? I make a point of learning about those around me, particularly those who might be stronger than me. It's a good ninja strategy. He waved airily. The girl laughed, tilting her head to say, sorry, but you don't look like a very good ninja, with that grass and leaves in your hair. Tactfully, she didn't state that his reputation as a dead last was well known around the village, spread by people crowing in delight over how weak he was. That's okay. He knew it too. I thought the point of being a ninja was deception. The boy shot back with a wide, friendly grin, running fingers through his hair to get the leaves out. The girl thought about it and conceded, okay, what do you know about me? The boy shrugged, and sat there, thinking. Well, obviously I know about your team and John an instructor, but that's not so much about you, is it? You hang out with Neji a lot and train alongside him because neither of you want to train at the pace that Lee or your instructor set. You specialize in weaponry, and your teacher says that you can hit a bullseye 100 out of 100 times. Most of your weapons you summon from scrolls you carry with you, and your most powerful technique is your rising twin dragons, where you jump up high summoning dozens of weapons out of 2 scrolls which you throw in a really fast barrage at your target. By now the female genin was surprised. That kid really did know some stuff about her. But Naruto wasn't finished. He was scratching his head. Some girls around town say you have a crush on Neji, but don't think he returns it. You want to prove that female ninja can be as strong as males ones, and you admire Tsunade, the slug Sanin. Wow, you really do know a lot about me. The girl was impressed, and trying hard to hide both her blush at the crush thing, and her disappointment that her peers felt she wasn't getting through to the Hyuga boy. Reading her face expertly, Naruto felt a little ashamed and tried to soften the blow. Don't worry too much about the Neji thing. The guy can be a bit of a pain, but he's really unhappy himself. The Hyuga family have this big thing where the main house are rulers over the branch house, who they treat like slaves. They even put a brand on their forehead, a seal that can kill them if they disobey. Neji's father was the twin of the clan head, but because he was born a few seconds later he got stuck in the branch house. He resents Hinata because he doesn't think she is strong enough to be in the main house. And then his dad got sacrificed to save the life of his twin, who is her father. So, yeah, he's got issues. He tried to finish off with a merry chuckle, but it came out sounding nervous. Tenten's eyes were wide. How did he know all this? She'd been a teammate of Neji's for over a year now and never heard any of this. I'm kinda dating Hinata right now, Naruto concluded lamely to cover the question he could see in her eyes. The whole thing upsets her. Concluding that he had to be right, girls were more talkative than boys, the girl relaxed, then changed the subject. So what are you doing out here all alone? Happy to be back on a safe topic, and deciding he could even tell the truth, Naruto held up the scroll he'd been studying. Oh, training to be a better ninja. I don't have many techniques, and this was supposed to help me. I guess I got so tired reading it that I fell asleep. He. She smiled at him. Lionheart. I. Tenten turned out to be a wealth of information on useful techniques no one had ever taught the village pariah. Like Naruto, she didn't have many special ninja powers, but she did have her signature technique of storage seals. Like Naruto, the girl was something of a combat expert, although ranged instead of melee. And, also like Naruto, the one power she did have made her more effective at her specialty. But where he spammed a battle with clones to augment his effectiveness, she used storage seals on scrolls to carry far more weaponry than she could otherwise lift, much less control. But both of them were combat multipliers, making them better at that which they could already do. He threw more punches, and she threw more weapons thanks to their signature techniques. And yet, it was one of those sorts of situations where each one could add to the other. Hey, Tenten, how about we teach each other our moves? You mean, I'll show you mine if you'll show me yours? She giggled. Something like that. He looked away, embarrassed. It just struck me, how my technique and yours could add to each other, 'cause a shadow clone can throw loads of weapons, too. So, in a way, we'd both get the best out of each of them if we added our techniques together. Yeah, that makes sense, she agreed. Great, he agreed. Then with a bamf of smoke after forming a hand seal, a clone of him appeared and started to write. I'll have him write down the shadow clone technique so you can study it at your leisure. Now you go. Okay, the girl blinked. I guess that works. The boy shrugged. Well, it took me a couple of hours to learn shadow clone and they tell me I'm exceptionally fast, that most take weeks. I'll be glad to help you study it later, but I think you'll need some time to look it over. Okay, she chirruped far more happily. So let's get started. Do you have a blank scroll on you? We can use the back side of this one. It's blank. He held up Ebisu's scroll. That works. She laughed, and they got started. Naruto had always had an exceptionally fast learning curve once someone actually taught him something, and Tenten was a good teacher. Soon he had the basics mastered, he didn't even need a repeat to get that far. In fact, they hadn't used up all of their morning before the test started. And that raised his ninja techniques from 5 to 6, although seals were in a special category that people didn't often list when they counted special moves. Still, that didn't make him any less glad to have it. And the way Tenten explained it, storage seals were massively useful, too. You could carry camping gear and supplies on long missions, spares for your normal equipment, like clean clothes, and even hot food, all without weighing yourself down or losing speed. It made most of the worst aspects of being on long assignments almost not difficult at all. It was, in its own way, just as helpful as being able to create a million copies of yourself. One of those force multiplier thingies. Only, since they each gave benefit a different way the bonuses stacked. And, in a little less than an hour, Naruto was doing well enough at it to get by. Now that he knew the difference between a crude performance and a refined technique, he wouldn't call himself an expert at storage seals, and Tenten most certainly was. But she taught him well enough to get by on. Reading together and discussing the shadow clone scroll he'd made for her took another 10 minutes, before she agreed she wasn't ready to try that just yet, as it did sound pretty difficult. However, they still had a great deal of time in what she'd allotted for her morning training schedule, so he joined her for that and started learning how to throw weapons effectively. They covered only a tiny bit of that at the academy, just enough to get you started, really. Also, they stuck primarily with the kunai, that all-purpose ninja tool, apparently thinking that anyone who wanted to know more could learn on their own. Tenten had. That girl could throw anything, even things that ordinarily could not be employed effectively as thrown weapons, like sickles and long swords. She taught him a lot, cheerful all the while, but Naruto had a long way to go before he'd be anywhere near as good, and probably never could be quite as good given the muscle memory limits he had to work under. Still, he could get somewhere in that skill, and he intended to. Even if he could only have the basics that was still going to be useful. After all, he could only crowd so many clones in punching range around a target at once, but if they stood back and threw weapons, well, they could do more. So he made certain he knew how to train further in this by himself before they moved on. She even dropped hints that a person could steer weapons with wires, and that sounded fascinating. After all, a number of very deadly things could be done with wires, the trick was getting an opponent to blunder into them. But if the wires delivered themselves, attached to weapons, double bonus. He'd have to learn more about that. In fact, he'd just found a new specialty he wanted to study. And, what's more, she seemed eager to teach him, almost surprised that anyone would value her skill enough to want to learn it. That any girl so talented could have confidence problems amazed him, but no longer surprised him. Look at Hinata, loveliest, nicest girl in their class, and all but ignored by all and sundry. He wished he could say he wasn't equally to blame for that. Hey, Naruto, Tenten asked as they were walking away after training. Yeah, he turned his attention to the girl he was rapidly becoming fond of. So few had treated him decently, let alone shared their techniques with him so readily, that he knew he would be spending a great deal of time with her in the future. Pity that she wouldn't remember it. That seal thing the Hyuga put on the branch house members. She asked. When one of them gets married, do they put it on their wives? I dunno, the boy answered honestly. They might, but I'd have to find out to know for sure. Could you? It's kinda important to me. Sure. I know they put it on little kids, though. I think Neji got his when he was about 4, or 6, or so. Tenten scowled at the thought of anyone doing that to children. No way was someone going to enslave her kids. But, darn it, if Neji was a slave, then Neji couldn't stop them from doing that to his kids. Which meant, if she didn't want it to happen to her kids, she couldn't marry Neji. Tenten sighed, giving up on that dream. And it hurt, too. Then she perked up. Say, want to come back to my place? You've got to get something to eat before we go to that training area 44 thing later today, and I feel I owe you one for all of this information. Sure, he agreed, then sobered instantly on thinking about the test. Oh, and Tenten, about our test. It's a week-long survival mission inside a forest where all of the genin are trying to kill each other. Each team starts with one half of the mission requirement, and you have to get the other from some other team. No holds barred. There's going to be a lot of death. At least half of those who enter are going to fail, and most who fail will probably die. Her face hardened. That was hard tactical data, priceless in ninja terms. Thanks, Naruto. But there's more, he cautioned. The teams from Sand and Sound are particularly deadly. Both have attacks you've never seen before. The Sound guys you could probably take if your whole team hit them hard and fast, but they're no ordinary genin. The Sand team, he shuddered. They'll kill you. I've seen Gaara, the lead on the Sand team, fight, and he could take down Lee even if he'd opened all the celestial gates he could. He's no genin, unleashed at full power he's closer to cage rank. Not even Neji would stand a chance. By now the girl was done being surprised that he had such information on her team. It seemed like he was right, he had been disguising his skill and secretly gathering information. So she was all ninja as she asked, what does he do? He animates sand. I know it doesn't sound like much, but he can move a few tons of that stuff like it was a part of him, reaching and grabbing, crushing and killing. If it touches you, it's over. It also forms a shield around him. Your weapons would be useless. Not even Lee's best punches could penetrate all of the way. And the girl on that team is also bad news for you. She's a wind mistress, and has ability to knock flying things out of the air, things like thrown weapons. She'd be able to shut down even your rising twin dragons. If you do have to fight her, do it some other way than by throwing things. She nodded, absorbing the tactical brief and analyzing it already. And the third? Konkuro, he responded. A puppet user. Basic strategy is to hide and let his puppet do all of the fighting. He'd be much less of a threat if you could tell which was him and which was his puppet, but he's expert at making that hard. It's strong and got built-in weapons, and can take a fearsome beating. If you could fight the guy himself, though, he isn't too bad. Best bet would be to strike him hard by surprise, before he deploys it. But considering the rest of his team, I'd avoid combat altogether. He's great at throwing delays and diversions at people, and the other two would finish you off. The girl is nearly unbeatable at a distance, and Gaara is suicide to face at close to mid-ranges. Together, their team hasn't got any exploitable weaknesses. Again she was nodding. Hey, Naruto, do you mind if I just drop you by at my place while I get some errands done? You can wash up, and I'll be back to get you that breakfast I promised, I just have some things to do first. Sure, no problem, he chirruped gladly. They both knew she'd be running off to give her team his warnings. What he didn't know was that she had a keen enough memory to repeat it word for word, even complete with tonal inflection. She trained to be in infiltration once, briefly, before they'd told her that female infiltrators usually had to sleep with their marks. But one of the skills of an infiltrator was to know memory tricks like that, and she'd gotten them. Naruto wasn't the only one to use those memory techniques taught by books in the library. It was a shinobi village, and they had many who had an interest in remembering things without writing them down. Of course, In the perverse way of things, she would tell her team and Lee would go tell Sakura. Who'd tell Sasuke, but only after asking Ino if she had heard. And Ino would tell her team, while Neji would feel obliged to inform the main house, who'd instruct Hinata, who'd tell her team, and so the rumors would spread like wildfire through Konoha practically word for word, until at the meeting outside the Forest of Death every Konoha genin, and some few from other villages who'd kept an ear to the ground, was outfitted for a long stay in wilderness terrain, carrying extra weapons and in some cases armor. Many would be carrying a written form of Naruto's warning that someone had copied onto paper and distributed, some even falling into other hands. There was also a wide gap around the Sound and Sand teams, with people eyeing the Sand trio with respectful hostility out of the corners of their eyes. Those few who didn't already know what was up noticed and asked, so got whispered to, and the circle around the Sand team grew wider. Some specifics hadn't made the rounds. So rather than Gaara could take down Lee even if he'd opened all the celestial gates, it was transmitted as he could take down a Jonin easily, while the Neji part was simply dropped. Still, it was an effective message, and people were already plotting out evasion strategies. They were ninja. If something was too tough to fight, you went around it just like any other obstacle to your mission. I've got to find Gaara. I must grow by defeating strong opponents. You know his powers are all based on a bloodline, don't you? Naruto asked, disturbed by this change. There's nothing there you could copy. I've seen him, he just stands there while his sand moves and kills people. You've seen him? Sakura asked, disbelieving. Yeah. Naruto shrugged. It was like Haku and his ice mirrors, only 1,000 times worse. That Gaara guy gets off on killing. From what I've heard even his own village is terrified of him, and that includes his siblings, who make up his team. That guy likes killing the same way you like Sasuke. It defines his whole being. Our Hokage might not even be able to take that guy down. Really? Sakura, at least, was frightened. Sasuke was not. I've read the reports, and don't believe them. He's just a genin. With my Sharingan I could destroy him. Naruto blew out a long sigh, rolling his eyes. It's your funeral. Finding Gaara's team was easy. If Naruto hadn't already had transformed clones following all of the teams in, he would have now. The one following the grass genin, the ones Orochimaru and his cronies had replaced, died as usual, but in the ongoing effort to track him, there was always another place just where the last one had lost him. There had to be something the Sannin could sense about them, because he never failed to notice one of his clones for long. And he'd change course in order to evade the emplaced ones. He was, Naruto reflected, a master at this. An evil, sadistic and sick-looking bastard, but also a master ninja. Still, of all of the things Gaara was, hyper-aware of his surroundings he was not. The Sand team wasn't even particularly on their guard, waltzing in like a pack of lions at a sheep festival. They had good reason to, the comparison was an apt one. No team Naruto was aware of well, except the Sannin, but he didn't count, could present a credible threat to them. What was unusual was that this time around the other teams seemed to be aware of that, and were departing from their usual schedules to avoid the Sand team whenever and wherever they made contact. This was starting to frustrate Gaara to no end. He wanted death and blood, and by gum he was going to get it. Fortunately for the homicidal insomniac and his two increasingly nervous siblings, who'd begun to fear, and rightfully so, that Gaara might turn on them just to sat a bit of his bloodthirst, Sasuke was enough of a egomaniac loon that he actually thought he could beat them, despite all of the testimony to the contrary. No, to Sasuke's mind there was no other form of life half as good as an Uchiha. So, being naturally superior to all other creatures out there, he was going to take down their best and impress them all. Just to show them. A suicidal form of egomania, as there had been plenty of Uchihas killed in battle against those same, lesser creatures, before. After all, there had been a whole clan of them at one point, and never had one of them been Hokage, or called the best ninja of the village. The Sharingan had weaknesses, not the least of which seemed to be the habit of those who had it to overestimate themselves. Sasuke himself had been so paralyzed from killer intent alone by Zabuza that he'd been ready to commit suicide on the spot until Kakashi reassured him. But that didn't stop his arrogance now. It was as if he could no longer even recall that event. And what made matters worse, Sasuke's feelings of innate superiority and invincibility were only exceeded by Sakura's feelings on the same subject, namely, that her crush was superior to all other creatures and invincible. Between the two of them they created a very dangerous delusion, that led very quickly to Team 7 standing on one side of a clearing, with the Sand siblings on the other. And Gaara hadn't killed anything all day. He was feeling overdue. His tone was very low and level, a danger sign to all who knew him, when the container for the one-tailed beast said, "You are here to validate my existence." Naruto rolled his eyes when Sasuke walked forward to pose and brag, "I am Sasuke Uchiha. I care nothing for your existence." Sasuke shot a hard glare over his shoulder at Naruto, whom he'd overheard whisper, "Truer words were never spoken." Turning back to face the Sand team, this time with a deeper scowl on his face, the Uchiha bragged, "I am going to defeat you and claim what is mine by right. As a Chunin of Konoha I will have more power to defeat my brother, and then I will revive my clan. Go Sasuke." Sakura bounced up and down twice, cheering. "Oi, Temari!" Naruto shouted through cupped hands. "Do you want to step aside and talk with me while your brother slaughters my teammate? You know Gaara's going to win, so I have no point in fighting you, since my team will be disqualified anyway. What do you say, Naruto?" Sakura tried to bonk him on the head, only for the blonde guy to dodge her attempt, laughing. Sasuke was glaring at him in disgust, while the Sand team didn't know what to say. Already Naruto was skipping a significant distance over to the side, pulling out the dining room set he'd made for himself and putting a feast on the surface. "Hey, Kankuro, you're invited, too. There's more here than she and I can eat. I'd ask Gaara to the table but know I'd die before I could leave it again. So I think if he wants to eat he's going to have to wait until I can scurry off into the forest like a frightened rabbit. I don't feel like being crushed to death today." Once a check with Gaara proved he didn't care, the Sand siblings left his side, smirking, to join Naruto at the meal. "Thanks." Kankuro picked up a slice of roast and popped it into his mouth, chewing for a moment before he added potatoes and gravy, vegetables and juice to his palate. No one else would have noticed the slight signal he gave to Temari, who only then chose to seat herself, but Naruto had figured the puppet master would send in his toy first. He hadn't known it could test food for poison, evidently it could. But, strangers in a strange village and all, he guessed he couldn't blame them for being prepared. Out of curiosity, he watched to see if he could tell when the real Kankuro would switch in for his dummy. The food was excellent, and Temari was making no secret of that as she joined the Konoha genin in digging in. Out on the playing field, a drama was beginning to develop. "Who is your brother? I will kill him for you," Gaara softly stated as he stared at his most recent prey. "Only I get to slay my brother," Sasuke snarled. "Only an Uchiha can kill an Uchiha. Go Sasuke." Sakura pumped a fist. "So, what kind of craftsmen do you guys have in Sand? I know you can't grow crops there, so you import most of your food, so I figure you have something to export." Naruto conversed reasonably, after pouring himself some juice. "Steel, mostly," Kankuro chomped with his mouth full of rolls. "We've got tons of the stuff near the surface, just covered by sand, metals of all kinds actually. Our weapons are good enough, most of you guys in Konoha use them." "Really? I didn't know that. Where do you get the carbon from? I know iron comes out of the ground, but..." "Shish." Temari hushed them. "Give your teammates some respect. Those are his last words out there, after all." A vein was pumping on Sasuke's head at not being the center of drama. He chose to ignore the sideshow for now and focus on the real opponent, and the glory it would gain him to defeat him. Then Naruto had to take even that away by cupping his hands and shouting, "His brother is Itachi Uchiha. Now get on with it, or are you planning to bore him to death?" Sasuke's fists were trembling and he nearly broke his staring contest with Gaara to go over and clobber his teammate. Sakura was not so restrained. A lot of it's in the ash we get as a byproduct from running our forges. We do have mines for coal, otherwise we'd be stuck importing wood, and the prices would break us. Kankuro continued, as if he'd not been interrupted, having his dummy trip and immobilize Sakura, muffling her screams as she shouted over the outrage of it all. Actually, it's hard enough as it is. I can imagine, Naruto empathized. And can I just say how impressed I am that in spite of how closely I'd watched you, I hadn't caught the change of position between master and puppet. Thank you, Kankuro demurred. Can you pass the butter? Certainly. Oh, yes, I'd forgotten dairy products don't ship well. You must not see many of them in sand. More than you'd think, the puppet master said around a mouthful of buttered potato. Tamari couldn't help herself and broke down laughing helplessly at the sight of it all, this casual conversation over the backdrop of her brother's murder. Gaara himself was finding this a unique experience, which is why he'd not rushed things further. But no point in waiting any more. He spoke softly to Sasuke, I will kill your brother, because you will be unable to. No, it is my destiny. I must defeat Itachi. Sasuke shouted. No, Gaara disagreed. You are mistaken. You have no destiny. You are already dead. That was when the Uchiha felt what was going on at last. Sometime during this conversation, sand had crept up over his toes, climbed up his legs and was entering his shorts. At the very moment he noticed it, the pool of sand around his ankles made a lunge and captured the lower half of his body. He struggled, but he was already tightly bound, his hands trapped beside him as the sand lifted him into the air. Gaara's voice continued soft. You will not be reviving your clan, either. Blood spurted from the trapped Uchiha as Gaara's sand crushed Sasuke's balls. Yes. Naruto pumped a fist. I am definitely making sure this happens again. Even his tablemate stared at him oddly after that pronouncement. Moments later, Sasuke too, had met his demise, his Sharingan useless against Gaara's sand, having already been trapped before he was aware of danger. So, Naruto turned back urbanely to his conversation. What kind of fan is that, Tamari? Is it special made? Where do you get them done? Later, marching away from the strange luncheon, having given up their scroll and heading toward the exits while the Sand siblings went on to the tower, Sakura was glaring holes in him, refusing to speak. Oh, give it a rest, the boy chided. I didn't actually bring my dining room set with me today, Naruto admitted. So instead I transformed a few clones into replicas of them. If Sasuke had one it would have been easy to detain or give the others crippling injuries, since they were already, literally, in my laps at the time I'd be revealing my trap. Lionheart. I. The next day, after the reset, walking past the pair of disguised Chunin on his way to the written test as usual, but thinking about the events of the last time through, Naruto paused and asked, pointing toward the door. Okay, I know that is an illusion, and you two are Chunin. So how do you do that? The pair of disguised Chunin snorted. What? The door? It's called the veil technique, and with it you can cloak small areas in a different appearance. So, how do you do it? He pressed with just enough eagerness to get their egos stroked. One of them shrugged. It's not hard, only a D rank technique. Mostly you just take a standard transformation and project it outward. You have to stay nearby or it falls to pieces, and it costs more chakra to keep active. But it can be useful to fool clueless goons, like most of you hopefuls. And the hand seals. Here, one of them showed him. Now get out of the way and don't clue in anyone else. We have a job to do, weeding out the unfit. I. Having liked the last set of events he'd set in motion, Naruto decided to repeat it for a while. That meant passing the test and forging a note to Ebisu so he could get the scroll so he wouldn't look odd to Tenten when she woke him up in the morning after sleeping outside in the forest. They'd trained together, and pretty soon he had the basics of all of her tricks down. All that was left from that point was to refine and practice them, but doing so he got to be good friends to her. She didn't remember him past any resets, obviously, but as he learned to like her and know her better he was able to learn her buttons and impress her and build a surprisingly good relationship in a fairly short time. While obviously not in the same boat as him, Tenten was a very lonely girl and eager to have more friends. He found it easy to respond to that, and soon was seeking her out for more than just training. There were also those conversations, learning everything he could from the sand team. And the entertainment value of seeing Sasuke's balls crushed over and over somehow never grew tiresome. It just kept getting funnier every time he saw it. He'd even spooked Gaara once over how hard he'd laughed while Sasuke got gelded. But it was all for training purposes, really. He had to repeat it all that way, because, yes, there was no other way to get the Sand siblings to the table, that was it. Useful information and all. It was just a side benefit that seeing the psychopathic insomniac creeped out by him was a hoot all on its own. But forming a few hundred shadow clones into a harem variant that had them all dressed like cheerleaders, and having them all loudly celebrate the sand demon's victory jumping about waving pom-poms wasn't too much, now was it? No, there had been some times in there where he'd really disturbed Gaara. As far as training, things were going swimmingly there, between Tenten's help and Ebisu's scroll. Plus, he also had a significant personal project on his own he was fitting in on the side. Learning how to project a transformation technique when what he did wasn't a standard transformation was a fair bit of work. He tried his own as a basis and it didn't work, or at least it wasn't possible given what knowledge he had. Luckily, at least no one was out to stop him from learning an academy-level technique, so he could go ask Iruka or look it up himself to learn the basic transformation, the real one this time, in addition to his own version. For simplicity's sake, he decided to call the academy version the disguise technique within himself, because that was all it did, and his own shapeshift, as that was equally descriptive. Picking up the disguise technique was easy by now, as was perfecting it, as he already knew all of the ins and outs and tricks for it, having done it all already for his own, much harder version. His improved chakra control over his academy days helped a fair bit, too. From there it really wasn't too hard to take it that one step further and get a version of the veil going. Knowing the internal workings of the disguise, as he did, made the rest of it seem easy. His experience with the shadow clone also helped him quite a lot, and his mastery of the basic clone also pushed his knowledge along, as that one already dealt with a projected illusion. Really he found it so easy he was surprised that it wasn't harder. Oh, there were a great many details to work out yet, blurred edges and all of the things Ebisu had named, but he was able to get something going quickly. And that gave him a significant hope, as between his disguise and the new veil he'd have 3 illusions to show off to Kurenai. Mastering them wouldn't be too difficult after all he'd already done, and with 3 good, solid illusions to show her instead of one he'd have a greatly increased chance to convince her to accept him as a student, even if just for 1 hour. 1 hour, that he could be infinitely repeating. No, his chances for acquiring a specialty were definitely looking up. Even if it would be months of work on his own to get these perfect, he now had a route to follow that he could work on that led to a definite hope of success. It would have been enough by itself to keep him interested, but there was also training alongside Tenten in the mornings. Also, at the same time, he was getting to know Temari and Kankuro more on the other end of that same schedule, having bizarre lunches with them while Gaara squeezed Sasuke's balls to mush before crushing him to death, and the Sand siblings were also surprisingly good people, once you got to know them. Perversely, they were almost as lonely as Naruto was, and for almost exactly the same reasons. On that surprising basis, he found himself building something of the same odd friendship he had with Tenten with them. Naruto learned to love Kankuro's sense of humor, and found flirting with Temari so fun that once he delayed and delayed at the table until before he knew it Gaara was sitting there with them. Being within arm's reach of the deadliest person outside of Orochimaru he'd yet met was something both frightfully terrifying and yet strangely normal after all that had happened. Really, it was exactly like he was just playing in a movie instead of feeling he was there for real. And, to him, it kind of was, as no matter what happened, the next day, all the players would be back to their starting positions, ready for another take. Plus, he got a good amount of valuable information out of the Sand siblings. who were, admittedly, amused by his attitude towards his teammate's death. So he might as well have some fun with it when he could. Although it was creepy when Gaara whispered across the table to him, "Are you here to validate my existence?" Then the blonde from Konoha found a new depth of bravery he hadn't suspected in himself and reached across the table, offering his hand to the red-haired boy. When the short psychopath didn't seem to know what to do with it, the Konoha genin offered him a grin as well. "Here, take my hand." Strangely, Gaara did so, placing his own in the proffered grasp. The demon container from sand had no fear, as he knew next to nothing could hurt him. The sand shield that protected him was automatic, and even if it were not, he had his sand armor on. No, this clasping of hands was akin to a mouse asking a serpent to open wide. It gave every advantage to Gaara at no danger to him. Naruto clasped his hand around the other and smiled, saying, "Gaara, I don't need to die to validate your existence. I can do so as your friend, instead, and I acknowledge you. You are important to me. You are significant, and you can make the world a better place for everyone if you choose to do so." Gaara continued to stare at him for a very long time, before releasing his hand and not killing him. His siblings were shocked speechless, to say the least. Kankuro dropped a fork since he was so stunned he'd forgotten to hold on to it. Gaara didn't let Naruto leave his side for the rest of that reset. The next step, Naruto thought, was to find some way of doing that before Gaara killed Sasuke. If he could do that, then they could advance through the test and possibly he could discover something about getting out of this loop. Of course, that was made more difficult by Sasuke picking fights with Gaara and interrupting his plans to befriend him before anyone died. Naruto was so preoccupied by his thoughts of how to discuss things with Gaara before Sasuke died that he forgot the next time to pass on his warning about the test to Tenten, which meant that news did not spread, and Sasuke did not hear it. Naruto tried to tell him directly, only to not be believed. So, there they were, getting attacked by Orochimaru as usual when it just got too much to handle, coming as an interruption to all his other plans, as it had. "Oh, I give up. Just bite the bastard and be done with it. I'm tired of this." Naruto folded his arms, sat down, and pouted. "Kuku. Orochimaru laughed, before deciding, "Thank you, I believe I will. But aren't you in the least bit worried about my killing your team?" "Faye, why should I be?" Naruto started to pick his nose. "They're all useless. Look at little Miss Trembling over there. As near as I can recall, she's never hit anyone in anger except for me, and she does that for me trying to be nice to her. All she does in a fight is stand there and tremble, waiting for her hero to come make it all better, then afterwards she's all proud and boasting as if she'd won the whole thing herself." Sakura's jaw had dropped open and she stared at Naruto, too shocked to tremble anymore. Shocked, and a little bit afraid, Naruto's loyalty had been the one thing she could always count on in her life, and now he was giving her up to die. Suddenly she felt very small and vulnerable. "And that useless waste of flesh you're facing," Naruto pulled out his finger and wiped it on the branch. "He's as pathetic as they come. Every hour of every day since I met him he's spent feeling sorry for himself, and of course all of the girls our age are stupid enough to think that's cute. Everyone gives him anything he asks for and treats him as some kind of hero thanks to the family he was born in, but he's never done anything himself. As soon as he gets faced with anything the least bit hard he gives up, just like now when he was trying to give the scroll to you." "Oh, kuku. Interesting." The snake Sanin looked back to the boy who had been approaching him to surrender their team's scroll. The blonde genin snorted. "He's pathetic. If something isn't given to him for free by being a stupid Uchiha he doesn't want it, and then he has to go treat everyone else like garbage because he can, he's the Uchiha. Faye. Pathetic. Here we are in a fight for our lives, you're about to kill us all, and what does he do? He's playing sorry for himself, again. Heck, he's every bit as wimpy as his fangirl over there. But they're both so stupid they call me dead last, when it's always me who's pulling them out of these things. But when I do they both instantly claim credit for themselves, as if it was their worthless behavior, standing there waiting for someone to rescue them, that somehow saved the day. Without me, they'd have lost every fight they've ever been in, they'd both be long dead by now, both them and their teacher, but they have to treat me as if my grades at the academy somehow, mysteriously, make it so my saving their scrawny, pathetic, useless lives in every fight since then doesn't matter. Go ahead, kill them both. They deserve to die. Sakura, who'd been shocked out of her paralyzing fear enough to listen, winced at every statement. Then she looked over to Sasuke, questions in her eyes. Had she been fooling herself all along? It didn't seem possible, but suddenly Sasuke didn't seem so invincible anymore. The Uchiha, however, was enraged that anyone would dare speak about him like that. It was a close call, but he elected to attack their enemy instead of Naruto, and when he launched his attack, he actually impressed the snake summoning freak. So the freak beat him up, bit him, and was gone, leaving them all alive for the first time in what felt like forever. Naruto was so stunned he nearly fell off the branch he'd been sitting on. Sakura was torn between mortified, scared and furious. Sasuke would have been raging mad, but was too busy being comatose and nearly dead. Sakura didn't attack Naruto for only 2 reasons. Dealing with her crush was a higher priority, and she was now scared of him. Naruto was still blinking. They were alive. Okay, quick, commit what happened to memory so he could do it again. I. Later that same reset, they were both kneeling over Sasuke's feverish and shaking body in a shallow cave made by tree roots when it happened. Nah. Sakura cleared her throat painfully. Naruto, do you think, maybe after we get out of here, you could take me out? He'd been a complete gentleman with Hinata, after all. That lunch date they'd been on together had been very cute. Surely it couldn't be too bad. Sakura's reasons were complicated, and she didn't fully understand them herself. Yet suddenly the fear of losing Naruto's support terrified her, and she'd begun to realize that would hurt her, that no one else had been so nice to her, and that she'd been driving him away. So she'd acted to do what she could to reel him back before it grew too late. The boy sighed, diverting his eyes to go look out over the rest of the forest. Sakura, I asked you out once a day, on average, for 6 years. That's 2,190 requests for a date, and each time you turned me down was worse than the last. Sorry, but I'm not interested. Oh, Sakura was devastated. He'd gotten away from her. She didn't know how, or when it had happened, but she had lost him. Her attempt to reel him back had come too late, and she'd missed all of the danger signs of his approaching separation. She felt shame as she realized it had been too late to keep him before she'd even thought to try. What had she done? Had she been so terrible? Except, well, maybe she had. Looking back on it, she couldn't recall the last time she'd said or done something nice for the blonde-haired boy. She hadn't wanted to encourage him, but suddenly she realized that he'd become her foundation. He'd been her one constant, a never-ending source of affection bearing her up no matter how life got her down, her ace in the hole against Ino, and something to cheer her up every time Sasuke turned her down, and now she had truly lost him. She couldn't put to words how much that hurt, or how scary it was to find herself cut free of that support, to suddenly find herself adrift in the world having to face all of the little hurts and Sasuke's rejections on her own. With a bite out of her heart she realized Naruto hadn't even been calling her Sakura-chan. It had always annoyed her before, but now, she missed it. Neither drew any attention to the fact that she began to cry behind him. It was an hour or more before she choked out, shyly. Naruto. Yeah, he did not turn to look at her. She spent a moment shivering over his coldness. Do you know so much I never expected. Do you know any special healing powers? I think Sasuke could really use some help just now. The blonde boy softly sighed. No, Sakura, I don't. Oh, she replied equally softly, her voice tinged with concern on behalf of their fallen comrade, and his plight. Inwardly, Naruto was thinking, just because I don't know any right now, doesn't mean I won't. Sakura is right. Healing my own wounds real fast isn't an excuse not to have any medical skills, because people around me can get injured. I've been careless, not studying those before. Well, it won't happen again. Before we come to this place again, I'll be a medic. Maybe even good enough I can save Sakura from choking on her blood if that happens again. Sakura was so wrapped up in her own misery she did not take as good a care of Sasuke as she might have, and he died, the cursed seal having overcome his frail vitality without that tiny extra edge. Love has a healing power all its own, completely apart from ninja skills, and the focus Sakura had once given to Sasuke had transferred some of her energies to him during those critical hours while the seal was turning his own chakra against itself. No matter how weak or powerful, a person is always equally matched against themselves, and the body paid the price of this battle the cursed seal initiated, usually ending in death. It may seem a small thing, but that was really the deciding factor in who lived and died upon receiving the cursed seal. Those who had someone to love and care for them lived, as even so tiny a boost was enough to tip the balance, while those who did not died. Orochimaru was ignorant of this himself, having no idea why one person lived and another died, despite decades of experiments. Healing techniques, all being chakra-based, got turned about the same way as a patient's own chakra supplies and were useless. Love, being made up of an entirely different energy, made up the difference in a way that got around the cursed seal's effect. However, with Sakura focused on her own misery and suffering, she did not have the total devotion to spare that had been bolstering his constitution that final, extra degree their first time through the forest. So, Sasuke died, and they reset. Naruto started getting severely frustrated. It did not take him many repeats to discover that it was not his performance that made the difference in whether or not they all survived that fight with Orochimaru. It was Sasuke. Naruto could commit everything he had to that fight, or nothing at all, and it wouldn't make the slightest bit of difference. The only thing that mattered was getting Sasuke worked up enough to go all out against the snake Sannin. If Sasuke impressed Orochimaru, then the missing ninja wouldn't kill any of them in order to let Sasuke continue on in the Chunin exams. Sasuke, like everyone, needed a three-man team in order to progress, and as near as Naruto could tell, the freaky snake guy wanted that for some reason. A bit of trial and error proved that Naruto didn't even have to get sealed during those fights. It happened if he went all out and forced the freak to deal with him, but he didn't have to do that, didn't have to do anything at all. It was all Sasuke. Life sucked sometimes. Hey, Kabuto. Wait up. The named Genin and his team turned around to face the Uzumaki boy, who came running up to catch them, through the crowd leaving after the written test. Hey, the boy called out once he got closer. Kabuto, I need to be a medic ninja. Do you know how I should get started? You. Be a medic ninja? I'm afraid that's not really possible, Naruto. You'd need perfect chakra control, among other things. Kabuto laughed, but not with any real malice. Not about to be deterred, Naruto pressed on. What about that regeneration technique you do that I heard about? How do you do that? Still laughing, the silver-haired one shook his head. You know, if I felt there was any chance of you being able to use it, I'd never tell you. But just to show you how impossible it would be, let me show you how it works. Then you can try it yourself, and see how far away you are from doing this, and maybe pick a more reasonable specialty for your talents. Hey, Kabuto. Wait up. The named Genin and his team turned around to face the Uzumaki boy, who came running up to catch them, through the crowd leaving after the written test. Hey, the boy called out once he got closer. Kabuto, your dad is the chief of Konoha's medical squad, isn't he? I was wondering if you could introduce me. I was hoping to pick up some basic stuff to do in an emergency. My team hasn't got a medic on it, and that lady who is to give us the next test scares me. I've heard of her reputation. Kabuto smiled. It's no problem, Naruto. Why don't I show you some myself? We've got time before we prepare for the next stage of the exam. Hey, Kabuto. Wait up. The boy called out once he got closer. Your dad is the chief of Konoha's medical squad, isn't he? I was wondering if you could introduce me. I was hoping for some tips and pointers. I know a little, but my team hasn't got a real medic on it, and that lady who is to give us the next test scares me. I've heard of her reputation. Kabuto smiled. It's no problem, Naruto. Why don't I show you some myself? We've got time before we prepare for the next stage of the exam. Hey, Kabuto. I've been reading some books on how to be a medic ninja, but I don't feel up to a real challenge yet, and I've heard some rumors about the next stage of our test tomorrow. I'm worried that I might not be able to do enough for my team if anyone gets injured. So, do you think you could point me towards some resources? Kabuto smiled. I could help you myself. Hey, Kabuto. I've been hearing rumors of the next stage of this test, and I've got to say I'm concerned. I'm the only medic my team has got, but I'm only half trained and my medical techniques stink. I was wondering if you knew someone who could help me. Kabuto straightened his glasses. That's very surprising, Naruto. I hadn't heard you had any medical experience at all. But I'll be glad to help you. There is a spare office in the hospital that is usually empty this time of day. We can use the charts and tools there. You really need perfect chakra control to be a good candidate for learning this technique, Kabuto told him. Yeah, I know, but the girl on our team has no interest in such things, and I've been elected. So how do you do the technique? Well, it would be easier if you had more knowledge of anatomy. Say, Kabuto, do you know where the Anbu have their anatomy classes? You know, the ones where they study nerves and pressure points for taking down targets. Kakashi told us about how they train Hunter Ninja to do that. Yes, of course I know. They do get most of their supplies from the hospital, after all. But why would you be interested in such things? There was this girl who did this thing on our last mission to induce false death in a target she wanted to capture. Our teacher wants us to look up those points so we can recognize them next time. Personally, I think he's just doing it to get out of teaching us anything himself. Well, Naruto, I don't really have time to teach you anything further. My team and I have to get ready for the test tomorrow. But if you still want to learn more, how about I introduce you to my father? He could at least loan you some books. He has an extensive library. So what now? How do I get to be a better medic ninja? I don't know that I'd call you a medic ninja, Naruto. Your healing techniques are clumsy and unpredictable. Frankly, I don't know how you got them to work at all, given your chakra control isn't half of what it ought to be to even learn them. I know I'd certainly never want to be your patient. However, you've got all of the book knowledge we ask of even our best shinobi healers. In fact, you know everything they do. I'm impressed. The only things you lack are chakra control and experience. But if you do go after the latter, you'd better do all of your practicing on Missing Ninja, because I don't want anyone from Konoha subject to your clumsy attempts. Kabuto laughed, but not with any real malice. Not about to be deterred, Naruto pressed on. What about that regeneration technique you told me about? How do you do that? Still laughing, the silver-haired one shook his head. You know, some secrets are best kept in families, Naruto. My father showed me that one, and I'd rather not be giving it out to anyone else. Hey, Kabuto. Wait up. The named Genin and his team turned around to face the Uzumaki boy, who came running up to catch them, through the crowd leaving after the written test. Hey, the boy called out once he got closer. Kabuto, I need to be a medic ninja. Do you know how I should get started? You. Be a medic ninja? I'm afraid that's not really possible, Naruto. You'd need perfect chakra control, among other things. Kabuto laughed, but not with any real malice. Not about to be deterred, Naruto pressed on. What about that regeneration technique you do that I heard about? How do you do that? Still laughing, the silver-haired one shook his head. You know, if I felt there was any chance of you being able to use it, I'd never tell you. But just to show you how impossible it would be, let me show you how it works. Then you can try it yourself, and see how far away you are from doing this, and maybe pick a more reasonable specialty for your talents. Naruto grinned. Lionheart. I. Naruto was stymied. He needed extra chakra control badly in order to gain access to teachers with other abilities, and get some utility out of the medical stuff he'd already studied, and hopefully save Sasuke's worthless life in the forest of death so they could all move on. He didn't know about the love thing, only knowing that his attempts at healing Sasuke had never helped yet, and thought more skill would matter. And for that he needed better chakra control, as always. The trouble with that was, the only person who'd teach him any control was Ebisu, and he'd already gotten a scroll to study from the special Jonin. The genin knew from experience that unless he could toss it right back at the guy, saying he'd already read and then mastered it, he wouldn't get any further instruction from the man. So his study of that scroll had an increased priority. Let's see, he pondered as he chewed on fried lizard out in the forest, the same place he'd meet Tenten in the morning. It was a good spot, as he could study until he dropped from fatigue, then wake up to time with a friend. He also didn't have much of a food budget, so as his cooking skill increased he'd go out into the woods surrounding Konoha and find some herbs and animals to prepare, as that saved money for other things and was less boring than yet another meal of instant ramen. Yes, he'd loved ramen, but variety was the spice of life and now he wasn't getting it in any of the usual ways, so he'd branched out his diet. So far he'd eaten rabbit, deer, elk, moose and squirrels, and was starting on some of the less traditional game animals, like bear and, today, lizards. The meals he was able to prepare, as well as the greens he was able to find, were steadily increasing in complexity, quality and flavor. So far he'd only died a couple of times from eating the wrong mushroom or plant, and was getting better about spotting the dangerous varieties. That scroll Ebisu had given him was a fairly scholarly treatise that had only 5 elements described, although he knew there were 2 more: earth, fire, lightning, water and wind, and he'd seen Haku using ice, while the stories of the first Hokage all had him using wood. Of them all, only 4 were usable by everyone. The scroll did say that most people could use lightning, but not all, and he already knew it took a special bloodline to use the other 2. The scroll then pointed out that every village interpreted the basic elements differently as to which was superior. That was natural, he guessed, seeing as how they all came from differing countries with varying specialties, and the secrets they'd unveiled after using them for so long could improve them to the point of even reversing their natural qualities to make one strong even against those it was naturally quite weak against. However, despite all that, there were still certain things that certain elements always did better than others. Fire and wind lent themselves more naturally to offense than defense. It was true they could be used defensively, it was just harder. The same was true in reverse with earth and water, as each was far more easily used on defensive measures than offensive ones. Of course, people didn't always do what was easy. Being ninja, they often did the very opposite of what was easy in order to accomplish the unexpected. Lightning was almost like a cross between fire and wind, in that it had both of their strengths and weaknesses added on top of each other. That made it very easily used on offensive purposes, and equally difficult to use on defensive, except for the kill my enemy before he kills me sort of defense. Viewing it as a combined element like that, it was also easy to see why not everyone had the ability to use it. Both of the other combined elements he knew of were bloodlines. Maybe lightning use was too. One that developed so long ago that it had spread to nearly everyone, perhaps before they even realized what it could be used for. Oh well, not like it mattered anyway. The scroll also cautioned that an elemental affinity had to be developed. And, well, instead of the meaning the author had possibly intended of, whatever one you've got you'd have to work to increase, to the boy who was reading it, that meant, an elemental affinity was something you created. And, well, if you were creating one, why not all? It was just a matter of time and motivation to practice, right? And both of those he had plenty of. Settling down, he began to study the various exercises. To practice earth, you took a leaf and began infusing it with your chakra, hopefully drying it out to harden to a dirt-like consistency to eventually turn it into powder. For fire you did the same but tried to burn it. For lightning, the same, but you tried to crinkle it. Water, moisten it, and wind to cut it. They all sounded fairly simple. With a shrug, Naruto decided, I'm going to learn them all anyway. Might as well go in alphabetical order. Let's start with Earth. I. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. Naruto cried out through his microphone to a stadium audience consisting of thousands of exact copies of him, some female, all cheering and stomping on the bleachers he'd also created around the glade in the forest where Sasuke and Gaara were about to fight. And welcome to tonight's celebrity death match. The clones roared their approval, drowning out all other noise. In this corner, he waved to the Sand siblings, who were all looking more than slightly alarmed at suddenly being surrounded by approximately 4,000 shadow clones on stadium seats that had all appeared mysteriously out of nowhere. Gaara of the desert. A surge of cheers came from the crowd. And in this corner, he waved back to his own team, where Sasuke was looking utterly disgusted with him. The amazing, the stupendous, the colossal. He bent over to speak to another one of his clones, this one is a stage manager's uniform. Hey, what do you mean Orochimaru's not going to show? Use the substitute. That Uchiha kid. No way. He'd never last 10 seconds against that guy from Sand. I mean we're talking Gaara here. The undefeated village champion. Slayer of thousands, winner of over 100 private assassination matches. The Uchiha hasn't even killed a bug. It'd be a total slaughter to send him in against that trained killer. Do it anyway. Well, okay, but you've gotta switch all my bets around, everything on Gaara to win. Okay. He turned back to the studio audience, finished with his private conversation that everyone had heard. Now where were we? Oh, yes. Now, representing Konoha. The one, the only, the amazing walking ego, the pretty princess, and darling of Fire Country's pedophilic circle, the Dweebmeister. Equally loud boos and jeers from the clones met this pronouncement. Man, that's harsh, Kiba whispered to the rest of Team 8 where they had hidden out in the forest, drawn by the noise. Gaara, he's our man. He can't do it. No one can. Shouted an entire line of buxom cheerleader Naruto-chans, bouncing around shaking pom-poms. Sasuke was grinding the knuckles of his fingers together. He was going to kill him. The dope was going to die. How dare he mock him like this before an important fight? The winner of tonight's fight, Naruto announced, goes on to the finals for a chance to gain the coveted Chunin grade. A roar of approval from the audience Naruto's. And to the loser, he continued, once the volume had died down to a more bearable level, a consolation prize. The fact that they will no longer have to put up with Sakura's whining, seeing as how they will be mercifully dead. He didn't just say that, did he? Ino muttered in shocked awe, where her own team were hiding out in the woods overlooking this. Peanuts, popcorn, Cracker Jacks, Naruto clones dressed up as snack vendors were going up and down the aisles, and visiting all of the dozens of concealed teams hidden in the surrounding woods. Choji bought a raft of snacks while he had the chance, causing Ino to drop her face into her hands in disgust. I'm sorry, miss, one of the vendor clones informed Anko, where she was also overlooking this, having heard the noise. But I'm going to have to see some ID. You don't look over 18 to me. Seeing it was nothing serious, she'd stopped a vendor to ask about some sake. Pulling a wallet out of who knows where, she flashed him her nin ID card, and collected her bottle. And they're off. The announcer Naruto shouted out suddenly. The Uchiha leads with a glare to the left. A sneer to the right. Oh, it's brutal. But Gaara is staying calm in the face of this fierce disapproval. That was it. Sasuke decided. The dope was going to die. There was nothing that was going to save him from his wrath after he got through with this. He'd live long enough to get the team to the tower, so that he wouldn't be disqualified and lose his own chances, but after that. And it's that patented Sasuke scowl. You're seeing it yourself, folks. A move that he's been practicing for the last half-dozen years is now seeing its first appearance in a real death match. But Gaara seems unfazed by the blow. Slow and painful. Sasuke decided. It was going to be slow and painful. He faints with a pout. What will it be next, folks? Oh, I can't believe it. It's the dreaded eye twitch. Can it be that Gaara has gotten through to his ego already? Impossible. There's no creature on Earth more arrogant than an Uchiha. He can't be giving up yet, folks. I can't believe that Sasuke hasn't already killed Naruto for this. Ino said between mouthfuls of popcorn with extra butter. He would have if he could tell which was the real one. Nara sighed, reclining beside her with a bag full of peanuts. So troublesome. And it's back to the scowl, folks. I haven't seen action this intense since Sasuke nearly killed himself out of sheer terror and hopelessness at his own weak and useless condition on facing his first real opponent on a C-rank mission. Announcer Naruto shouted enthusiastically into his microphone. Did that really happen? Kiba turned to Hinata, who nodded, having heard the story through the Kunoichi grapevine. Although the version the fangirls told was more sympathetic than that one. The dog user enjoyed a laugh at that information. Oh, we've got a lip curl. The Uchiha is really pulling out the stops here, ladies and gentlemen. I wonder how Gaara of the Sands can stand it. Gaara of the Sands was actually enjoying himself immensely. He couldn't quite remember what approval felt like, but now he had a whole stadium audience pouring it off onto him. And he liked it, even if they were all thousands of the same boy giving it. And the Uchiha takes it up to the next level by slipping into his, "I'm an angry pretty boy," stance that makes him so popular with disgusting old men and brainless fangirls. Hey! Ino cried out, still safely back in the woodlands. She'd always thought Sasuke looked cute like that. Nara stifled a snort before he could break out laughing and offend Ino, who'd clobber him for it. Off in his part of the woods, Kiba felt no need for any such restraint and howled openly, clutching his gut as it hurt from so much laughter. Hinata was busy eating her footlong sausage on a bun, covered in mustard and relish, that a vendor Naruto had given her, compliments of the house. With a silent glance to ask approval, Shino helped himself to one of the sodas out of the six-pack by her side. The energy of the sugar in the soda water would help aid his bugs if it came to a conflict. Anko had spilled her sake, roaring with unexpected laughter as the arrogant little prick got taken down a peg, by his own teammate no less. Wiping her mouth off on her sleeve, she signaled a vendor for another round. Yes. The announcer went on. The Uchiha has slipped into his, "feeling sorry for myself" defense. There's nothing that Gaara can do to hurt his feelings now, folks. The Uchiha has preempted all attempts to make him feel bad by already inflicting misery on himself. This never fails to get the fangirls falling all over him. It's going to be over soon, now, ladies and gentlemen. And, yes, Gaara makes a move, instantly crushing Sasuke to death using the sand the Uchiha had been ignoring pooling up at his feet all along. It just goes to show, folks, that you should never play hurt feelings in a real fight. He will have to be satisfied with our consolation prize. And our winner is Gaara. The clones went nuts in their cheering and applause. Several teams of female Naruto cheerleaders bounced around excitedly spelling out Gaara's name letter by letter while leaping and cavorting about waving pom-poms. The after-game wrap-up show was almost as much of a spectacle as the actual match, with thousands of Narutos marching around on parade. They even had a brass band. Kakashi, when he found out, went so far beyond upset that angry didn't even begin to cover it. It was as though they'd done it to him instead of Sasuke. The amazing copycat ninja got so intensely mad he actually pulled out his thousand birds assassination technique in front of the Hokage, and Naruto almost got it between the eyes. No, he got it to the chest instead, and Naruto got the unpleasant knowledge that he could actually live through having his chest blown open by Kakashi's one-hit kill technique. Still, the reset put everything back to normal, as usual. On reflection, Naruto considered his chakra control dilemma to be becoming desperate. He was running out of things that he could learn and still claim were at all useful to becoming a better ninja. Okay, it was nice to learn flower arranging and all, but unless he was going to go undercover as a girl somewhere, it was hardly critical knowledge, and after his recent surge of abilities, slowing down like this was very distasteful. He loved learning under Tenten's tutelage, but she was an excellent teacher and only knew so much herself. So it was not long before she'd pass that on to him. The time spent bugging Kabuto had been plenty to learn all she could teach and then some. Oh, he was only hitting 40 times out of 100, half that with exotic stuff that wasn't meant to be thrown, but without muscle memory and still having to think through every action. That was as good as he was probably going to get. She was skilled enough that many of the tricks she knew for rapid throwing rates and pinpoint accuracy she couldn't pass on to him until he'd crested that limit. So, sadly, now he was hanging around her for fun instead of a vast increase in ninja skills, like he'd earlier enjoyed with her. Still, he was plenty willing to have fun and hang out with her just for the sake of it. People were probably the most interesting things about this whole reset scenario. You read a book and you've read it, there wasn't anything else there. But people had so many depths and hidden triggers, even when you think you know them well, there was always more to discover. On that thought, hey, Ebisu, what do you do for fun? You know, when you aren't training young ninja or out on missions. Seeing as how the blonde genin asking this of him was doing as he'd been told, turning this way and that, lifting one leg, and so on, the special Jonin decided he'd be agreeable in return and answer, lest Naruto start being difficult. So he adjusted his glasses and thought a moment. Frankly, I like to draw. Naruto nearly fell down from where he'd been balancing. Wow, that he hadn't expected. Really? Yes. The special Jonin gazed off into the woodlands. You don't truly see beauty until you learn to recognize it. The world is an amazingly lovely place, but how often do you pause and appreciate it? No, I draw because it gives me a sense of connection to the beauty all around us when I pause and study it. Wow, who would have thought? Naruto blinked twice in shock, before using his head to turn around and really look at stuff, having before just seen a sort of mental summary of things he could use and things he couldn't. Then he really saw what the special Jonin had been talking about, the way the wind blew, rustling leaves, glints of sunlight through the trees. It was gorgeous. How had he missed this? He'd been standing right in the middle of it this whole time, how could he not have seen how lovely it all was? Ebisu, as a teaching specialist, decided to turn this into a teaching moment before the young one could forget this instant of realization and dismiss his words. As ninja, we have a very dangerous profession. All of us are subject to great stress performing our duties. It is vitally important, young Naruto, to understand that you cannot accumulate stress forever or it will destroy you. You must have some way of reducing or escaping it. For some, this thing is alcohol, for others. He snorted disdainfully, pornography, or obsessions with power or control. But all of those are self-destructive habits, not nearly so bad as going rogue and killing your clan, but ultimately destructive to you and your abilities. No, I do not recommend them. They are the choices of those who have made no choice before their stress grew so great it demanded that they do something to relieve their suffering. The special Jonin reoriented on him, the light glinting across his glasses as he turned to look at him. No, everyone needs peace, a way to find their solace and unwind from the stress of our profession. You can choose a destructive habit, or a constructive one. I choose to draw, and the feeling of connection with the beauty of nature this gives me has so far suited all my needs. Naruto was nodding, still caught up in wonder. Wow, who would have thought? It was several moments before he regained his wits after his surprise at the beauty all around them. By then Ebisu was gazing at him smugly, smiling over his folded arms. You see. Taking a deep breath, the boy nodded again. So what now, Ebisu? He still needed to progress, and for that he needed to master that scroll, so he could eventually learn something else. After all, the public library didn't have scrolls of ninja techniques. Even well-known ones like body flicker were still held as semi-secret, and were passed down in families for the most part. All of the scrolls detailing them were in private libraries, usually owned by clans. Ebisu paused in his instruction as his student got a wicked gleam to his eyes. I can't believe I hadn't thought of this before, Naruto mused to himself under his breath. I mean, I know where the bastard hangs out, and he's not going to come anywhere near this place all day, maybe never. I can't recall ever seeing him come here, even before we started to repeat. But, if you are going to steal techniques. He looked up at the gates to the Uchiha district, standing before them debating whether or not to disguise himself as his broody teammate. Why not steal from the best? These guys have been copying the techniques of others since before this village was founded. They've got to have some useful stuff hidden in there somewhere. The sort of stuff they were famous for copying is exactly the kind of thing no one else will teach me. In the end, he decided not to use a disguise this time. Plenty of opportunity for that later, if he had to. And he did not want to wear the broody bastard's face any more than needed. So he pushed open a small, door-sized, side gate beside the grand main ones big enough for parade floats to pass through and slipped right in. Dang. This place is extensive, Naruto muttered to himself as he beheld the interior of the walled compound. The only thing he could think of to compare it to was the Forest of Death, only it was on a different side of the village from that perilous place, and slightly smaller. But for a clan compound that was unbelievably huge, especially when you accounted for all of the buildings covering the place, in between the parks and private training grounds. There were even untended farms lying fallow, that had once been worked by hired laborers. It wasn't that big because the population had demanded it. No, there'd never been all that many Uchihas, 100 at most. But, judging by what Naruto saw, they had lived like kings. Apparently being copycats paid well. Still somewhat awed by the size of the place, Naruto started exploring. Of course it couldn't be that easy. Yes, the place was full of traps, it was part of a ninja village, after all, but what of it? Traps were no barrier to a ninja who could create thousands of solid clones and tell them to go first. No, what really tripped him up were the tiny seals inscribed on each window and door of the place. Small, unobtrusive, and the very first time he broke one, a full Anbu team appeared, summoned to that location by the disturbed seal, whereupon they immediately took him into custody and dragged him before the Hokage, who blinked when he saw him. Oh, Naruto, what were you doing in the Uchiha district? I was looking for Sasuke Tem, the blonde lied easily, with the practice of long experience behind him to make it convincing. He'd promised to teach me the grand fireball technique, but I couldn't find him anywhere. So I went to look for him at his house. Relieved, the old man tapped the ashes out of his pipe, motioning for the Anbu team to stand down. Oh, you wouldn't find him there, Naruto. Sasuke lives in an apartment in town. Here, let me give you the address. As the old man started to write, the demon container shook off the arms of the Anbu still holding him. Hey, old man, why is that place so big, anyway? Did we have millions of Uchihas, or something? Sarutobi chuckled at the question, presented Naruto the paper with Sasuke's address, and sat back, lighting his pipe. Actually, the size of the Uchiha district had nothing to do with their numbers. The grant of a large compound was a tool used by the first Hokage to draw the status-conscious clan to join his new village. At the time before there was a village here, the land was practically worthless, so it cost the first Hokage virtually nothing to make even so grand an offer. So a huge plot of land was used as bait to stroke the egos of a very proud clan, and it worked out marvelously. So why doesn't Sasuke Tem live there? The blonde looked at the address on the paper before crumpling it in his fist, as Sarutobi expected him to do. He'd had a great deal of experience in acting and how to throw off suspicion. The Hokage's face darkened. Naruto, I don't expect you to remember, but when you were about 6 years old, one of the most promising prodigies the Uchiha clan have ever produced turned rogue and slaughtered his family in what is now known as the Uchiha Massacre. So what's that got to do with anything? The genin blurted, interrupting as he knew the old man expected him to. I was just coming to that. Sarutobi set down his pipe in a tray and folded his gnarled old hands. I suppose I should not be surprised your teammate never mentioned it to you. It has always been a sore subject for him, but it was his older brother Itachi who murdered his clan. A person Sasuke had always before looked up to and been told to emulate by his father, killed his father and mother in front of him, then subjected him to several days of torture using a special illusion. Heck, the only thing Sasuke's ever told me is that I'm an idiot, and that he's better than everyone else 'cause he's an Uchiha. The orange-clad boy folded his arms behind his head and casually examined the walls, trying to hide how much that still hurt, especially since Sasuke's mood wasn't great during the test and he was having trouble remembering better times, if there were any. Come to think of it, Sasuke'd always been something of a stuck-up bastard. Why did he hang around him again? Oh, that's right, he'd had no family and zero real friends, so he'd substituted by annoying acquaintances in order to get people to recognize him. Sasuke and Sakura had been his prime targets. The Hokage sighed, reading that interplay as though he could see inside the boy's mind. Yes, I've heard that boy tends to keep people at a distance. It is not healthy for him. I was hoping, when I formed Team 7, that your friendly and outgoing nature would be good for him, and that if you became friends his popularity would benefit you in turn. Naruto glanced at the guy out of the corner of his eye. News flash, Gramps. It didn't happen that way. He and his fangirl take turns abusing me, and when it really matters they gang up on me. Sarutobi shrank in on himself a touch. Yes, I'd heard that, too. Naruto turned back to examine the walls. So what part about being a stuck-up, selfish bastard makes him not want to live at home? I'd thought having such a huge place would only help prove he was better than anyone else. He's always looking for stuff to prove his arrogance is justified. The old man blinked at hearing the word, justified, come out of Naruto's mouth, and, without reacting to it, the blonde genin made a note not to use it the next time they had this conversation, should they ever do so. Still, the moment of surprise was not great enough to stop him from answering the question. After the catastrophe, Sasuke didn't want to live where he was constantly surrounded by reminders of what he had lost. So I made a deal with him. The Uchiha district is, as you pointed out, surprisingly large, and no sooner had that clan accepted the first Hokage's offer than other member clans were grumbling about it. So I felt I could satisfy everyone in one great move. I could help a child with too much on his shoulders while resolving the animosity among our other clans at the same time. Sarutobi gave a very sad smile. I truly thought I was being quite clever, and felt I would resolve a long-standing bitterness if I offered for Konoha to buy the Uchiha properties from Sasuke at a fair price for all involved, then turn around and sell them again to whoever wanted them. Thus, none of our clans could complain again about the large land grant, because everyone would have had their own chance to bid on them, along with everyone else. While Sasuke would be well provided for and away from painful, traumatic memories. Naruto glanced at the Hokage, then slagged down into a chair, mannerisms just screaming, get on with this, even though he was secretly quite interested. Sarutobi leaned back and drew several long drafts on his pipe, thinking he was torturing the young genin by the delay, but he did eventually continue. Sasuke agreed, and packed everything he wanted from the estate. He did not take much, as I recall. I offered to pay for several genin teams to help him move at Konoha's expense, but he turned down my offer and left with only what he could carry. The old man started to look very tired as he continued. As for why Sasuke didn't take more, I believe that is in 3 parts. First, he was traumatized and wanted to get in and out quickly. He likely wasn't thinking clearly or as the last Uchiha. Second, the use of the library had been pounded into his head from an early age. His family was so firm about treatment of their collection that even I know the rules. Don't lose or damage any scrolls or books you take, return them when you're done, and if there is only 1 copy left then either make another copy or don't remove it from the library. Third, he was aiming at getting memories and what he and Itachi had been learning at that time from their father, everything else was secondary to that goal. Naruto gave the Hokage a bored look that was completely at odds with his feelings inside, which thought this was fascinating. Ah yes, Naruto, the punchline. I am coming to that. The joke was on me, after all, because no one in Konoha wanted to buy the Uchiha lands. After the massacre happened some felt it was cursed, some felt it was haunted, some just couldn't fathom the idea of wanting to even be near the place after what occurred, some felt it was dishonorable to use the lands after what had happened there, and so on. In the end, no one wanted the Uchiha lands. I was, obviously, fairly annoyed, especially with those who had previously been very vocal about the subject. Sarutobi gave a sad sort of smile. There was nothing I could do, though. Konoha owned the land, no one wanted to change it, everyone for differing reasons, or even go near it. We covered the buildings with seals to keep out squatters or infiltrators, and patrol it every so often to keep it clear, but ever since that day it has just sat there, a permanent reminder of what Itachi did to his family. Sasuke, I understand, has never once gone near the place since he left it. Yeah, but at least that bastard gets to know who his parents were. Naruto bit off that statement bitterly, folding his arms behind his head to look away from the Hokage sullenly, mumbling, and he gets love and respect of the villagers. Kakashi teaches him techniques, and, the voice grew too soft for even the Hokage's sharp ears to follow. Sarutobi winced badly, then broke out in a wan smile as he reached for a price of paper. Naruto, how would you like your own district? The boy's shocked and grateful eyes grew round, then he consumed the old man in a hug. Yes. Too bad the library of the place was impossible to find. Lionheart. I. Every morning, or every other morning when he'd choose to pass the test to go on die fighting Orochimaru, or laugh himself sick as Gaara gelded Sasuke, Naruto woke up to the same old broken down dive he'd always lived in. Although, ever since he'd begun his home improvement kick, he'd wake up to create a steadily increasing number of clones to work on the place while he was away. Lately he'd been creating close to 600 clones every morning just to fix up his house. They'd strip out everything except the support beams for the upper stories, then go to work. By the time he came back for lunch, if he came back for lunch, variety was the spice of life. After all, his apartment would cover 2 entire floors of that building that were formerly empty. No one wanted to live too close to the demon brat, with open internal balconies, galleries, brand new custom furniture and floorings, everything clean and bright, newly painted and with glittering fixtures. The entire place was a palace. Of course, the Uchiha district was simply enormous, large enough to practically count as a village unto itself, with its own shops and everything. But now it all sat empty. It would be a mistake to say that Naruto bought it. Actually, the Hokage gave it to him for free, reasoning to the boy in private that he could not make up for his harsh life in other ways, but perhaps this could go a long way toward giving him a brighter future. In public he had no need to say anything but that those lands were his to distribute as he chose, and no one else had wanted them in all the years they'd been available. So, like the first Hokage had done, the third made them a grant, as he had the authority to do. And, since he'd learned how to get the Hokage to do that for him, Naruto did it often, because after every reset it was back to that same old dingy dive he'd always called home. Interestingly enough, having done a little research, he knew what was now the Forest of Death had once been offered as the same deal to another clan, one that had not, in the end, elected to join the newly emerging village of Konoha, but had stayed in the Land of Mist where their valuable abilities had since been destroyed when that country turned against and murdered their bloodline-carrying clans. The land, initially kept reserved in case they'd changed their minds, had since come to other uses as a survival training ground and testing area. But all of that came about later as he was doing research into the district and discussing the history of the place with Sarutobi. Ever since he'd started getting it, he would spend some time there searching as he poked further and further into the former Uchiha lands. For the moment, he was busy looking for their library of stolen ninja techniques. It was not easy to find. Hardly surprising, really. The Hokage had doubtless been searching himself, and sent teams to do likewise before they'd closed it all down. The collection of scrolls on stolen techniques must represent an incredible resource, if only no one could find it, and Sasuke wasn't talking. Perhaps the bastard realized what he'd given up, and had been trying to figure out a way to get it back, after having spent part of the money. Nah, that was really unlikely. Anything Sasuke wanted, he got, as someone was willing to give it to him. No, More than likely he was just being a bastard about it, denying the village help because he could. It was also possible the bastard had forgotten where it was. After all, he'd been quite young when he'd left the place, and that might have gotten caught up in all of the general repressing he did over the rest of that trauma. Sasuke was not a well-adjusted, happy boy. It was also possible the broody boy had never known about it. Children blab things without meaning to. So, if it was all so desperately secret, they just might not have told the kid where it was before they all died, just handing him scrolls as needed. And if that were the case, the Uchiha was too proud to ever admit it. Anyway, no longer dipping into the Uchiha's mind, it was an icky place. The Uzumaki boy had spent several entire resets after finding out how to get the Hokage to grant him those properties, going over them and looking for those scrolls, only to be disappointed. They were really marvelously well hidden. But then he had an idea. It struck him, as he'd been thinking, that somewhere on the Uchiha property was the Uchiha library, containing whatever records they'd made of special moves and ninja powers stolen over entire generations of using Sharingan, that, it was presently hidden in such a way that unless he could somehow get his own Sharingan, the most likely key, he was unlikely to find it. Ever, considering how hard he'd looked already. His clones were in the process of dismantling buildings, and if they hadn't found it by doing that, they were not likely to find it at all. Although there were plenty of ordinary secrets around the place. Who knew that the Uchiha were such perverts? There was stuck in practically every wall of every home, concealed by who knows who for what reasons. Although, he was learning a great deal about traps as he dismantled the places, and the Uchiha had some fiendish ones. Too bad most couldn't be used out in field conditions. Still, that wasn't a total loss, as it had reminded him of something. Namely, Sasuke's techniques hadn't come out of nowhere. He'd known some C-rank special powers even before he'd graduated the Ninja Academy, which was also long before he'd gotten his Sharingan activated. So, no Sharingan meant he couldn't have just copied them, which meant that he'd learned them from somewhere. Since it was unlikely his family taught him, seeing as how they were all dead, and had been long before the Uchiha had started to use those techniques, the most likely answer was he'd learned them off scrolls, perhaps taken from that exact same Uchiha library. So, what would an arrogant bastard do with a scroll detailing a secret ninja power after he'd learned what it could show him? Why, nothing. He'd leave it wherever it happened to be when he got finished with it. Because, you see, arrogance makes people do things like that. And especially in the Uchiha's case, where people were falling over themselves in eagerness to do things for him or give things to him, he didn't have to be careful with anything that he had. There is a word for that, and it is called spoiled, a word that suited Sasuke perfectly. He was a perfect little spoiled princess. Everyone in Konoha loved him and gave him whatever he wanted, while he pouted about it not being enough or good enough for him. So, figuring that unless Sasuke gave it away once he no longer had need of it, and not finding that likely, as the Uchiha was far from generous, Naruto felt that the most probable place for those scrolls to be abandoned was in the bastard's apartment. So he broke in to go looking for it, one day while a clone was off taking the written test to cover for him, so he could be certain Sasuke wasn't home, or going to be returning there for an hour or more. That was all the time the blonde burglar would need to ransack the residence of his rival, especially with a dozen clones to help. He could go over every inch of it to be sure not to miss anything. They struck pay dirt almost at once. It wasn't even hard. On a shelf next to the dining room table was one of those little honeycomb hold organizers meant for holding scrolls. Most of them were slightly dusty, and seeing as how Naruto knew his teammate had a cleaning lady that was sad, as it said he almost never read them. Which suited what he'd expected, actually. A couple of those scrolls were worn, like they had been well read. Taking one down to look at it, the blonde burglar found on it the basics of how to use the Sharingan, for those that had the bloodline. What to expect from activation and so on, including cautions on its use, mostly a warning to beware of the level of chakra drain. Nothing terribly hard to understand, although it did contain some specifics that outsiders to the clan would probably find useful, such as limited range, included as part of a caution that anything not clearly seen could not be adequately predicted or copied. So it wasn't telescopic vision. That was good to know. If a normal person could not see it in sufficient detail to read, the Sharingan couldn't copy it. If that sort of information was widespread, then everyone facing one of this clan would do Zabuza's thing of hiding out in mist or fog to hunt these guys. Oh well, nothing there he didn't already know. But it was nice to see it spelled out in detail. 2 more of those scrolls showed the basics of a fighting style, developed by the Uchiha after a generation of stealing the best they could see. On the few scrolls he had available, it wasn't much, not too different from the style taught at the academy, but it did show a few moves Sasuke had used that were not taught to ordinary ninja. It probably got into greater detail on more advanced scrolls, but those were not present, only the basics, probably what Sasuke had been working on at the time the clan died. The last of the frequently read scrolls was solid gold, as far as Naruto was concerned. It contained several fire techniques, the 2 that he'd seen his rival use, plus 4 others. The later ones on the scroll hadn't been read as much as the first 2, while the last had hardly been read at all. Naruto palmed his face and sighed. Somehow he'd always figured as much. Deep down, the bastard was just as lazy as Kakashi. Once something got hard, he'd stop even trying. Maybe having the Sharingan made you stupid. Unable to read. But no, that couldn't be right. To get the early parts of this scroll so worn, his rival would have had to have been studying this for years. Yet, he hadn't mastered the whole thing. Naruto didn't know about anyone else, but he would have been using all 6 of those special moves in a month, tops. And that was even before he really knew how to read. Most likely he would have blitzed through them in less than a week, frying himself several times in the process of learning them, but still. To have had such wealth and not devoured it was inconceivable to the orange-clad boy, whose appetite for ninja skills was insatiable. And that fire scroll was just one of many. The next scroll Naruto pulled down from that shelf was a new edition by the look of it, yet still several months old. But when he opened it up, it explained itself, because at the top was a note from Kakashi, saying that these might help the Uchiha to become a better ninja. On it were 3 earth techniques. 1 for making a wall of earth spring up out of the ground to protect you from opponents, and the 2 Kakashi had used to defeat Sasuke during the Genin test. 1 that allowed a user to hide underground, even moving a short distance through dirt, and the other where you dragged your victim down into the earth until only their head stuck out. By the looks of it, their teacher had to have given this to Sasuke right after the test, or at least in that time frame, yet it was brand new, it had never been opened, much less read. Naruto stood there, fists clenched and steamed. How could Sasuke be so wasteful? And Kakashi? He'd never once offered to train his most desperate student in anything useful. The blonde had begged and pleaded for scraps of attention, for any hint of training, and yet here he'd showered it on the pretty head of the Uchiha. Even when he didn't want. In the midst of this upset, a light bulb went off over Naruto's head. This had been the way it had always been between them. Kakashi would ignore him to favor Sasuke, while Sasuke didn't work hard or appreciate. That was it. The one time Kakashi had done anything close to training anyone other than Sasuke was that tree climbing exercise. Sakura had gotten it right away, while Naruto had pressed hard, and the Uchiha only worked at it because he didn't want Naruto to get the move down first. Kakashi was using him as a tool to motivate the Uchiha who, by the looks of the things found here in his room, didn't work hard for anything if he could avoid it. So why hadn't he done those contests more times? Probably because Sasuke'd asked him not to. Kakashi would never do anything Sasuke didn't want. He loved him like a son and wouldn't deny him anything, including having his rival held back, and Sasuke, Sasuke practically defined his existence by being better than Naruto. No, not just better, by utterly leaving him in the dust. The greater the gap between their abilities, the more the Uchiha would gloat and boast over it. So that's why Kakashi hadn't done any more of those, race you to learn this contests between him and the Uchiha, even though it did serve to motivate the broody bastard. After all, whenever Kakashi made the two race to get a technique down, they'd both still learn it eventually. And Sasuke felt better about himself when Naruto knew nothing. It gave him a better opportunity to shine, after all. The bastards. Grabbing all of those scrolls so he could memorize them over the rest of the day, and who cared if the Uchiha found them missing. They'd all be back in place after the reset anyway, and the Uchiha would recall nothing of it. Naruto almost missed one that had been tossed into the back like garbage. Peeking at it, Naruto found it to be a scroll of very minor ninja techniques useful in camping. But scribbled across the top, in Sasuke's handwriting back from 3rd grade or so, was, "Not going to help me beat Itachi." So, that made it garbage, did it? Naruto didn't think so, and he grabbed that scroll along with the others to go and study their contents. Unlike certain Uchihas, he wasn't going to turn up his nose at any chance to increase his skills or knowledge. It disgusted him that anyone could call that sort of pathetic person a genius. On his way out, his clones stopped him to see a discovery they'd made while prying up floorboards. Hey. It didn't matter if they got caught ransacking the place, as it would all be back to normal either tomorrow or the next day. Down in a dusty corner, hidden under the floor, was a box of what had to be Sasuke's treasures. It held an ornate katana, a lady's jeweled pin, and a small box of family photos. Since some of those photos showed his dad with the sword, and his mom wearing the pin, the photos had names on the backs, it was easy to figure out these were all relics of his parents. Holes had been cut out of some of those photos, where, at a guess, Itachi had once been pictured. A name scribbled out here or there confirmed it. These treasures weren't exactly hidden in a convenient place, but neither were they left entirely alone. The nails and holes over the opening in the floor to reach them showed signs of having been pried open several times before. So, at a guess, the last Uchiha pried them up to look at his family mementos once or twice a year, or whenever his brooding began to falter. Acting on a bit of petty revenge, Naruto took the items to see how much a pawn shop would offer for them. Of course, armed with the Uchiha's bank account information, found hidden behind a painting in the sweet's kitchen, he had no need of extra money. One quick shapeshift and cash withdrawal would provide all he could want within his modest needs, he felt sure. But it was the spirit of the thing that counted. Sasuke treated what Naruto treasured as garbage, Naruto could do the same in return. Those purloined scrolls were a treasure trove of the highest order to Naruto, who'd been desperately seeking after such knowledge for years. Even if you didn't count all of the time pre-loop he'd spend long enough during endless repeating days, he felt that probably qualified alone. Even just the scrolls he had already opened amazed him with their utility. Opening them all revealed nearly 30 techniques, only counting those that Naruto didn't already know, averaging about 6 techniques per each of the 5 common elements, and most of those scrolls had never been opened. Not once, until Naruto had done so just now. In fact, floating down out of one was a note, almost 5 years old, inviting the Uchiha to special training, written by one of their academy teachers. Naruto didn't know if the man had gotten to teach Sasuke private lessons or not, and that was far from the only scroll about techniques given to Sasuke during his academy days. There were scrolls on the basic 3 with notes and details written in the margins that the Uzumaki lad had had to pull out of Ebisu a scrap at a time. Actually, Naruto scowled, reading on. Yup, Ebisu still hadn't taught him all of this stuff. There were a few ways to tweak those techniques that the special Jonin had never mentioned, like that basic clones did not have to be formed of the user himself, nor did they have to be of human or even animate creatures. The note told a story of a special case when an illusion of a deer, frightened away by an enemy's approach, had convinced a squad of ninja during one war that the victim they were seeking was not present, else he would have spooked the deer himself, when he was the one laying wounded under a bush who'd created the deer clone. And there were multiple anecdotes of enemy ninja scrambling for dropped weapons only to find, as their hands closed upon hilts, that the obvious ones they'd been seeking were simple illusions, and useless to them. Transformation and body switch had been put to similarly imaginative uses, all listed out here as suggestions for the Uchiha by generous professors. And for the most part, he'd never once even looked at the scrolls. Actually, looking at the dates, Naruto had to suppress another grimace of disgust, as these teachers had been trying to get Sasuke to learn the jutsus at least a year in advance of the other students being introduced to them. A genius. Oh, you bet. I mean, look at how fast he'd learn the whatever. Well, yeah, that was easy to do when you had a year lead in on everyone else learning them. Sasuke would have had to have a head like a block of wood not to have gotten them quickly or early. And somehow Naruto did not suspect those teachers had given up when he hadn't read their scrolls. All of the extra credit stuff was included that Naruto had never gotten invited to learn, too. There were techniques taught as rewards to talented students to help motivate them in classes, things like how to detonate exploding tags from a short distance, basic stealth and wire work, how to form tags into defensive traps automatically triggered by an enemy crossing the circle, and more. Body flicker, yep, everything he knew except the shadow clone and his own creations had been given to the Uchiha long ago, most of them with master's suggestions on how to really use the techniques to their full potentials. And, yes, the 3 basic chakra control exercises were all here, spelled out in detail. One of them was even a gift from Kakashi. Naruto, the boy had to stifle a sigh and wipe away a tear. He would have done anything for that level of support, for even half the assistance the Uchiha had received. But then he had to stifle a miserable laugh, too, as all of that put together, and what did Sasuke use? Sasuke'd known roughly 2 techniques, outside of the basic academy ones. 2. Here on these scrolls before him were listed nearly 30. A Chunin would have been happy to have that kind of technique arsenal. And here Sasuke could have had that as a freaking academy student. If only he'd listened to those who would have gladly taught him. It made him want to cry. All that support, and the Uchiha hadn't even wanted it. He'd certainly never come close to making the best use of it. Impotent jealousy gave Naruto actual, physical pain before he reined it in and mastered himself. Whining about the past couldn't solve his current problems. That was what the broody bastard did, and look at where it got him. He could have been a Jonin by now, easily, if he hadn't been feeling sorry for himself and had actually been willing to work hard for what he wanted. Naruto did not know what Sasuke's problem was, but he sure as anything wasn't going to share it. These techniques were before him, and he was going to learn them. No, he was going to master them all. Then he'd see what else he could do with those.